Jake Morrison had made a lot of questionable life choices, but accepting a spot at Galactic University as Earth's first exchange student was definitely in the top 3. Right behind that time, he tried to pet a raccoon and slightly ahead of his brief career as a cryptocurrency day trader. The classroom looked like someone had designed it during a fever dream. Desks floated at various heights because apparently universal gravity was considered oppressive to certain species. The walls shifted colors based on the collective mood of the students, which meant they'd been a nauseating shade of anxiety yellow since midterm started. Professor Quillneck stood at the front of the room, if stood was even the right word, for a 7ft tall crystalline being who technically just hovered while refracting light in pretentious patterns. They had spent the last 3 weeks of Xenobiology 301, absolutely convinced they were the galaxy's leading expert on ecological systems. Spoiler alert, they were not. Today, Quillnecks announced, their voice chiming like wind through a chandelier, "You will present your planet's ecological hierarchy. This is fundamental biology, people. Show me you understand the basic food chain of your home world." Jake glanced around at his classmates. There was Thumble, a translucent blob creature who sat in what could only be described as a very expensive bucket. Thrumble had spent the entire semester agreeing with everything the professor said, which was impressive considering Thrumble didn't technically have a head to nod. Next to Thrumble sat Keelix, a mantis-like being with 6 compound eyes that always made them look like they just remembered they left the oven on. All 6 eyes. Simultaneously, Kelix had anxiety issues that would make Earth's therapists rich beyond measure. The first few presentations had been mind-numbingly simple. One student's planet apparently had plants, things that ate plants, and one thing that ate those things. Quillnax had called it elegantly efficient. Jake called it boring as hell but kept that part to himself. He was starting to suspect Earth's biology might be playing on a different difficulty setting than everyone else. Jake Morrison, Professor Quillnax chimed, turning their fractalized attention toward him. "Please enlighten us about Earth's ecological systems." "I'm sure it follows the same elegant simplicity we've observed in other classroom planets." Jake stood up, pulling out his holographic display tablet. He'd spent way too much time on this presentation, mostly because his roommate kept asking horrified questions every time Jake mentioned a new Earth organism. "Yeah, about that," Jake said, powering on his display. "So quick question before I start. How attached is everyone to the concept of a straightforward, comprehensible food chain?" The walls flickered from yellow to a confused orange. Professor Quillax's crystalline structure sparkled with what Jake had learned to recognize as condescending amusement. "Jake, I assure you, all carbon-based ecosystems follow predictable patterns. Please proceed." Jake looked at his notes, then at the professor, then at Thumble, who was already quivering with teacher pet anticipation. "Cool," Jake said, pulling up his first slide. "Just remember you asked for this." The walls shifted to a deep, uncertain purple. To be fair to his classmates, their presentations weren't bad. They were just catastrophically boring. Thrumble had gone first, which was predictable since Thrumble treated every assignment like an opportunity to audition for the professor's favorite student. Their home world of Gorp 7 had an ecosystem that could be summarized on a napkin. Plants absorbed their triple sun's light energy. Large, slow grazers ate the plants. One apex predator ate the grazers. The end. Roll credits. Magnificent, Professor Quillnax had chimed, practically glowing with approval. A perfect demonstration of energy transfer through trophic levels. Simple, efficient, logical. Thumble had literally bubbled with pride, which Jake learned was their species' equivalent of blushing. It was gross. Helix had gone next, and their presentation had been even simpler if that was possible. Their planet had photosynthetic crystals at the bottom. Small mineral eaters in the middle and medium mineral eaters at the top. 3 levels, that was it. Their entire planetary ecosystem had 3 trophic levels, and half the class had gasped like Kelix had just presented quantum physics. Remarkable complexity. Quillnax had announced 3 distinct levels of energy consumption. Truly sophisticated. Jake had nearly choked on his imported Earth coffee. 3 levels was sophisticated. Earth had ecosystems within ecosystems within ecosystems. And that was before you got into the really weird stuff. A student from Sector 9 had presented next. Their food chain went fungus eater, done. Apparently their whole planet was just variations of mushrooms eating other mushrooms in a cycle that would make a stoner philosopher weep with joy. The professor had called it beautifully cyclical. Jake was beginning to understand that the galaxy's definition of complex ecosystem was wildly different from Earth's. The student before Jake had shown a chain with 4 whole levels, and 2 classmates had needed a moment to process the overwhelming intricacy. 4 levels. Jake's presentation had 40 slides, and he'd still had to cut content. "All right, Jake," Professor Quillnax said, their crystalline form practically radiating smug confidence. "Show us Earth's food chain. I'm certain it will be similarly straightforward. After all, classroom planets tend to follow predictable patterns." Jake stood up and caught Kelix staring at him with all 6 eyes, which probably meant they were either terrified or extremely focused. With Kelix, it was hard to tell the difference. "Right," Jake said, cracking his knuckles in a way that made several aliens recoil. Apparently that sound was universally unsettling. "Good to know. So full disclosure, I had to cut a lot of stuff to make this fit into one class period. We're going to be moving pretty fast." "I'm sure we can keep up," Quillneck said with the confidence of someone who had never encountered Earth biology. Jake pulled up his first slide, a cheerful diagram of the sun beaming down on some plants. Great, so anyway it all starts pretty normal. The walls were still purple but Jake noticed they were starting to develop some concerning red streaks. He pressed forward to slide 2. Okay, so we've got producers, Jake said, gesturing at the holographic plants rotating above his desk. They photosynthesize, convert sunlight into energy, standard stuff. Then we've got primary consumers, herbivores, they eat the plants. Professor Quilnax's structure brightened with approval. See, perfectly standard, energy flows upward through consumption. Right, sure, Jake said, advancing to the next slide, but then we've got decomposers, bacteria. Fungi, insects that break down dead organic matter and return nutrients to the soil so new plants can grow. The classroom went quiet. I'm sorry, Thumble burbled, their gelatinous form rippling with confusion. Did you say death creates life? I mean, yeah, dead stuff rots and feeds the soil, circle of life and all that. It's actually pretty efficient. Jake looked around at the sea of confused alien faces. Do your planets not have decomposers? Are deceased or inert? Helix chittered nervously. They simply stop functioning. They don't participate in feeding systems. Huh, weird. Jake shrugged and moved forward. Anyway, then we've got secondary consumers. Carnivores that eat the herbivores. Professor Quilnax's glow stabilized. Ah yes, the apex predators, the top of your chain. Oh no, Jake laughed. That's not even close to the top. That's like lower middle management at best. The walls flashed from purple to a dark orange. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their various sitting apparatuses. We haven't even talked about parasites yet, Jake continued cheerfully. Parasites? Quilnax's chime had developed a sharp edge. Yeah, organisms that live on or inside other organisms and feed off them while they're still alive, like tapeworms. They can live in your intestines for years, growing up to 30 feet long, just absorbing your nutrients from the inside. Thumble made a sound like a garbage disposal trying to process a fork. Oh, and here's the fun part, Jake said, pulling up a diagram that made half the class recoil. Parasites have parasites. We call it hyperparasitism. There's literally a saying, big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them and little fleas have lesser fleas and so on infinitely. That's not possible, Quilnax said, but their voice had lost some of its certainty. That's not efficient. Welcome to Earth, where efficiency went to die and chaos ordered pizza. Jake advanced to the next slide. Then we've got scavengers, organisms that only eat things that are already dead. Vultures, hyenas, certain beetles. Kelix's 6 eyes went wide, all of them at once. Then Kelix slid sideways off their perch and hit the floor with a clatter. Oh, they do that sometimes, Jake said as 2 students rushed to help. Anyway, scavengers are super important because they clean up corpses before disease spreads, which brings me to pathogens, but we'll get to those later. Later, Thumble's voice had gone up an octave. How much more can there possibly be? Jake looked at his remaining 36 slides. So much more, he said with a grin that made the walls turn completely red. We haven't even got to the weird stuff yet. Professor Quilnax's crystalline structure had developed a visible crack down the center. They hadn't said anything in 45 seconds, which was a record. Should I keep going? Jake asked. The professor managed a weak chime that sounded like breaking glass. Proceed. Cool, Jake said, pulling up a slide titled Apex Predators in letters that seemed almost threatening. Let's talk about the things at the top of various food chains. Helix, just now being helped back to their seat, immediately started hyperventilating through their spiracles. This was going great. So apex predators, Jake said, pulling up images of lions, great white sharks, and grizzly bears. These are organisms with no natural predators. They're at the top of their specific food chains. Professor Quilnax's cracked structure seemed to stabilize slightly. Finally, the top, the end point of energy transfer. Well, yes and no, Jake said. See, we've got dozens of different apex predators depending on the ecosystem. Ocean apex predators, land apex predators, aerial apex predators, they all kind of exist simultaneously. Multiple apex predators. Thumble sounded like they were gargling marbles, but that would create competition and instability. Yeah, it's a whole thing, but here's where it gets interesting. Jake advanced to the next slide with perhaps too much enthusiasm. We also have omnivores, organisms that eat both plants and animals, completely ignoring the rules of trophic levels. The classroom fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. They ignore the rules. Quilnax's voice had lost all its wind chime charm and now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Just completely disregard them. Take bears for example. Jake pulled up a picture of a grizzly bear looking adorable and fluffy. Look at this guy. Cute, right? Looks like you could hug it. This thing will eat berries, fish, deer, and absolutely you if given the opportunity. It operates on multiple trophic levels simultaneously. That seems very illegal, Kelix whispered, all 6 eyes fixed on the bear image. Oh, and raccoons, possums, pigs, lots of omnivores on Earth. Jake paused for bear, including humans. There was a beat of silence. I'm sorry, what? Thumble had stopped bubbling entirely, which Jake had learned meant they were experiencing existential dread. Yet humans are omnivores. We eat plants, we eat animals, we eat fungi. We're extremely adaptable, Jake smiled, which brings me to my next point. He advanced to a slide that simply said, humans are in the middle. Professor Quilnax's crystalline structure didn't just crack. It made a sound like a wine glass shattering in slow motion. Actual fracture lines spiderweb across their surface. The middle, they chimed weakly, but you're the intelligent species, the dominant species. How can you be in the middle? Well, see, that's the thing about Earth, Jake said, warming to his subject. Lots of things eat humans. We're not apex predators, we're opportunistic omnivores who got really good at using tools. What eats humans? Keelix asked, and Jake was pretty sure they didn't actually want to know the answer. Oh man, where do I start? Jake pulled up a new slide. Bacteria, billions of species of bacteria, some of which cause diseases that have killed millions of us. Viruses which aren't even technically alive but will absolutely end you. Fungi that can grow in your lungs. Parasites we already mentioned. Pions, which are just misfolded proteins that turn your brain into Swiss cheese. Thumble had begun making a sound like a boiling kettle. Then we've got macroscopic predators, Jake continued. Crocodiles, sharks, lions, tigers, bears, wolves, leopards, jaguars, venomous snakes, venomous spiders, venomous jellyfish, hippos, elephants when they're annoyed. Cape buffalo, polar bears, and cassowaries, which are basically dinosaurs that held a grudge. Stop. Professor Quillnax whispered, but Jake was on a roll. Oh, and mosquitoes, tiny little insects that kill more humans per year than any other animal by spreading diseases. We're talking over 700,000 human deaths annually from mosquito-borne illnesses. One of the students in the back made a retching sound, and brain-eating amoebas, Jake added helpfully. They live in warm, fresh water. You go swimming, they swim up your nose. And then they eat your brain. It's extremely rare but 97% fatal. Stop, Quillneck said louder, but their voice was flickering like a dying light bulb. Oh, and prawns aren't even alive, Jake repeated for emphasis. They're just proteins, rogue proteins that corrupt other proteins, mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Your brain just stops working and there's no cure. Not alive, still deadly. Professor Quillneck slumped forward onto their desk, which shouldn't have been possible for a being with no joints. Their crystalline form had gone completely opaque and was flickering between various colors of distress. Thumble had melted into a puddle that was slowly dripping off their bucket onto the floor. Kelix was breathing into a paper bag that someone had materialized from somewhere. The walls had turned black. Should I continue? Jake asked, the room at large. A student from the back shouted. No, but Jake was pretty sure that was directed at the universe in general rather than him specifically. Cool, because we haven't even talked about what humans do for fun yet, Jake said, advancing to the next slide. The collective groan from the class was deeply satisfying. Helix had just regained consciousness for the second time when they made their fatal mistake. How do humans even survive? They chittered weakly, all six eyes blinking out of sync. Jake's grin widened. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Professor Quillnex made a sound like wind whistling through a broken cathedral. Please no more. See, we don't just survive, Jake said, ignoring the professor's plea entirely. We domesticated our predators. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that exists right before something explodes. You what? Thumble had somehow reconstituted enough to form words, domesticated them. We took wolves, literal pack-hunting apex predators, and turned them into dogs. Now they live in our homes, sleep in our beds, and love us unconditionally. We did this on purpose for companionship. Jake pulled up a picture of a golden retriever puppy. This is a wolf, he said. That's a wolf. A student squeaked from the back. Well, technically descended from wolves. We bred them to be cute and friendly. Some of them are still pretty wolf-like though. He switched to a picture of a husky. This one will still eat your chickens if you're not careful. But mostly it just wants to sing you the song of its people at 3:00 a.m. Why would you allow predators in your sleeping areas? Helix sounded like they were about to faint again. Oh, it gets better, Jake said. We also domesticated cats, small apex predators that are basically tiny tigers. We let them sleep on our faces. They've got retractable claws, killing teeth, and the hunting instinct of their much larger cousins. Sometimes they bring us dead animals as gifts. That's a threat display, Thumble burbled. We think it's adorable, Jake countered. We post pictures of it on the internet. Professor Quillnex had gone completely transparent. Jake was pretty sure he could see their internal structure just giving up. We also keep apex predators in captivity just to look at them, Jake continued. We call them zoos. We preserve great white sharks, saltwater crocodiles, polar bears, and Bengal tigers just so our children can go stare at them on weekends for entertainment. Your offspring observe predators for recreation. A student Jake didn't recognize sounded horrified. Educational recreation, Jake corrected. But yeah. Oh, and some people keep venomous snakes as pets on purpose in their homes. The walls had gone beyond black into what could only be described as the visual equivalent of screaming. But here's my favorite part, Jake said, pulling up his final slides. We also eat things that are actively trying to kill us. No, Professor Quillnex whispered. Yes, Jake said. Pufferfish contains tetrodotoxin, one of the most lethal poisons on Earth. We have specially trained chefs who prepare it as a delicacy. People pay lots of money to eat something that could stop their heart if it's cut wrong. Kelix fell off their perch again, but this time nobody moved to help them. Rattlesnakes, we eat those too. We have to kill them first because they're venomous, but then we fry them up. Taste like chicken, apparently. Jake was really enjoying himself now. Oh, and we have peppers, plants that evolved capsaicin as a defense mechanism to stop mammals from eating them. We measure the spiciness in Scoville units. The hottest ones are literally measured in weapons-grade heat units. We eat them competitively. Competitively, Thumble repeated weakly. You compete to consume poison. It's not technically poison, just an irritant that makes your stuffed pain receptors think you're on fire. We have shows about it. People cry and sweat and keep eating because apparently suffering is fun if you choose it. Professor Quillnex's crystalline form slumped completely over their desk. Several pieces flaked off and tinkled onto the floor. "We also drink ethanol for fun, even though it's literally toxic to our liver," Jake added. "And some of us jump out of perfectly good aircraft with fabric parachutes, and we climb mountains that kill people regularly. And we invented something called free solo climbing, where you scale vertical cliffs with no safety equipment because the risk of death makes it more exciting." The class had gone completely silent. Even the ventilation system seemed to have given up. Jake looked around at the devastated faces of his classmates. At Professor Quillnax, who appeared to be experiencing a complete system failure, at Thrumble, who was now just a puddle with bubbles, at Kellix lying unconscious on the floor. "So yeah," he said cheerfully, "that's Earth's food chain. Any questions?" The medical team arrived 6 minutes later, which was apparently a new record for emergency response at Galactic University. They came equipped with oxygen supplements, psychological stabilizers, and what looked suspiciously like a defibrillator designed for crystalline life forms. Professor Quillnax was loaded onto a hovering stretcher, their fractured form carefully secured with specialized restraints. As they were being wheeled past Jake's desk, they managed one final flickering chime. "How?" they whispered, their voice like wind through broken glass. "How does your species cope with such chaos?" Jake shrugged, genuinely confused by the question. "We just call it Tuesday." Professor Quillnax made a sound like a chandelier being dropped down a stairwell and promptly lost consciousness. Thumble had to be scooped into a specialized containment unit, still making distressed bubbling noises. Helix required 3 medical technicians and a sedative that could tranquilize a small spacecraft. The student from the back who'd been sick had already left, presumably to reevaluate their life choices and possibly their entire understanding of biology. The university administration showed up 20 minutes after that, led by Dean Vortana, a gaseous being who communicated through color shifts in their containment suit. They spent 15 minutes reviewing Jake's presentation materials, occasionally pools in colors that Jake's translator interpreted as concerned disbelief. "And why would evolution do this?" Mr. Morrison, Dean Vortana said finally, their suit shifting to a diplomatic purple. "We're going to need you to submit all future presentations for pre-approval for safety reasons." "That seems fair," Jake agreed. However, the dean continued, their suit brightening to an impressed gold. "Professor Quillnax has already submitted your grade before their collapse. You received an A+. They were too traumatized to argue with your assessment." Jake pumped his fist. "Yes, finally my biology degree is useful for something." Word spread fast at Galactic University. By the next day, students were crossing to the other side of the corridor when they saw Jake coming. His table in the cafeteria had a 5-seat radius of empty space around it. Someone had started a campus forum thread titled, "Humans are terrifying and here's why." That had reached 50,000 posts in 12 hours. A journalism student from the campus network asked to interview him. Jake agreed, thinking it would help with Earth's reputation. The interview was titled, "Death World Survivor Casually Describes Apocalyptic Hellscape He Calls Home," and went viral across 6 sectors. 3 different species filed formal requests to have Earth reclassified from Class M habitable to Class X extreme hazard. The requests were denied, but it was apparently a close vote. Jake's roommate, a methane breather named Plarks, started sleeping with their environment suits sealed and had stopped asking Jake about Earth entirely. They'd been chatty before. Now they just nodded nervously and retreated to their side of the room whenever Jake came home. Professor Quillnax took a medical leave of absence for the rest of the semester. The substitute professor, after being briefed on what happened, began each class by asking if any humans were present. Jake had to raise his hand. The professor would then take a moment, compose themselves, and say, "Please don't volunteer information unless specifically called upon." 2 weeks later, Jake was in his dorm room when his communication tablet chimed. Message from home from his mom. "Hey, sweetie," the text read. "How's university? Are you making friends? Learning a lot? Dad says to tell you he's proud. Love you." Jake grinned and typed back, "Hey mom, everything's great. Remember how you always said my biology degree would be useful someday? You were right. I'm basically famous now. Love you too." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, looking out at the triple moons rising over the campus. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear what sounded like a group of students having an animated discussion about the human incident. Jake smiled. He had 17 more weeks of classes left in the semester, and he'd only covered basic ecology. Wait until they found out about Earth's oceans or Australia, or the fact that humans had survived multiple extinction-level events and just kept going out of spite. His next presentation was on human medicine. He'd already titled it, "Yes, we poison ourselves on purpose and call it treatment." This was going to be a great semester. The walls of his dorm room flickered briefly to yellow, then seemed to think better of it and went back to neutral gray. Even the architecture was learning.